Good evening, everybody, and thank you all very much for coming this evening. It should be a very interesting night, and we're all looking forward to it. My name is Maria Linders. I'm the current chairperson of the Italian Family History Group. And first of all, I need to say thank you very much to Antonio Luciano of Panorama Productions. He provides us with one of those films every month, which are all very greatly appreciated. So, what we've all come here to listen to is the wonderful Mark Tedeschi AM QC. You're probably all aware that he's the senior Crown Prosecutor for New South Wales. He has practiced in the criminal courts for some 40 years, both for the prosecution and the defence. Mark has won numerous awards for his photography and is also the author of 3 true crime books, Eugenia, Kidnapped, and his most recent publication, Murder at Mile Creek. Mark's family comes from Torino and Verona, and tonight Mark will tell us a little bit about his family, and then I think a lot about his new book. So, without further ado, I'd like to ask Mark to come forward and tell you all about his exciting life and books. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. It gives me great pleasure to be here. I'm afraid that my third book, Murder at Mile Creek, does not have an Italian connection. My first book, Eugenia, of course, does have an Italian connection. It's the story of Eugenia Fellini, who was born in Livorno, spent her childhood in New Zealand and came to Australia at the age of 20, and lived for 22 years as a man in Sydney. And during that time was married twice, and neither wife knew that they were married to anything other than a full-blooded Aussie male. And in 1920, Eugenia was charged with the murder of the first wife. So the story is about her early years, grappling with her gender identity, the 22 years in Sydney living as a man and how she managed to accomplish that, and then, of course, being charged with a very serious crime, and the trial, what really was certainly the trial of the decade, maybe even the trial of the century. My second book, Kidnapped, is about the kidnapping of Graham Thorne in 1960. If any of you were living in Sydney in 1960, and you're my age or older, I'm sure you would remember it. It's the only kidnapping of a child for ransom in the history of Australia, and it ended very badly for the young boy Graham Thorne, who was the victim. He died during the course of the kidnapping, and that book is the story about how the police managed to solve the crime, to work out who was responsible for the kidnapping and the murder, and then the trial of the kidnapper Stephen Bradley. My most recent book, which only came out last week, Murder at Mile Creek, is completely different. It's set in the colonial period of New South Wales. In fact, it's set in 1838. When I mention to people that this is a book about mass murder, if you talk about mass murder in the context of New South Wales, or in the context of Australia, people think of cases like Martin Bryant and the massacre at Port Arthur that he committed. They think of the backpacker murders by Ivan Milat, and massacres like that. At Mile Creek was completely different. Mile Creek was the mass murder of 28 Aboriginal men, women and children by 12 white stockmen at Mile Creek in northern New South Wales. Don't confuse it with the Mile Lakes or the Mile River, which is near Port Stephens. Mile Creek is actually near Inverell in northern New South Wales. And Mile Creek is one of the very few massacres of Aboriginal people that we know a lot about. And the reason why we know a lot about it is because the 11 of the 12 men who were responsible for this terrible atrocity were actually arrested, brought to Sydney and faced trial. And it's one of the very, very few massacres of Aboriginal people where that actually happened. In fact, it's probably the only mass murder where that happened, where whites were brought to justice in the early years of colonial Australia for the murder of Aboriginal people. For that reason, Myall Creek has come to be a bit of a symbol representing all of the many hundreds of massacres of Aboriginal people that occurred right throughout Australia from 1788 until probably the end of the 19th century, if not even longer. It was a very typical massacre in terms of how massacres went in those days. In 1838, the colony of New South Wales was exactly 50 years old. And on Australia Day in 1838, the whole of the Sydney white community was around the harbour celebrating the first major celebration of the establishment of the colony. It was a little bit later that year, in June of 1838, that the massacre occurred. And what happened basically was this. At that time, the forces of the law and the authority of the government in Sydney only extended so far. There were limits to how far government grants of land could extend. There were limits to how far soldiers and policemen could operate, and the magistrates. And outside those limits, it was really free rein for any pastoralist to actually go and just claim land as though they owned it. They didn't legally own it, they were just occupiers of the land, and they were called squatters because they had no legal entitlement to be on the land. And as the colony expanded through these squatters with their sheep and their cows, it was inevitably going to be at the expense of the indigenous population who had lived in those areas for many thousands of years. And what happened was what in the book I call a war of annihilation, a war of extirpation is what it was called at the time, because the pastoral interests of the landowners was considered to be much more important than the interests of the local Aboriginal people to possess their traditional lands or to have good access to their traditional sources of food and water. So as the sheep and the cows took over these rich pastoral lands, particularly in the New England district, the Aboriginal people found it more and more difficult to hunt their native animals. A flock of sheep or a herd of cattle could destroy a waterhole and make it unfit for human consumption within a matter of days or weeks. And there was a natural clash of civilizations, a clash of the white settlers and the black indigenous Australians. It was as a result of that clash, particularly in these areas beyond the reaches of the law, that these massacres often occurred with complete and utter impunity. What would happen is that there'd be some incident, perhaps some Aboriginal people would try and get rid of the cattle or the sheep, and they would do what was called rushing the cattle or the sheep, which meant stampeding them away from their traditional lands. And a group of white people would get mounted on horseback and go searching for the Aboriginals, and whoever they found of black skin, they would just massacre them, men, women and children. There was a station that was owned, in the squatter sense, called Mile Creek Station on the Mile Creek, and the squatter who owned it was a man called Henry Dangar, who was one of Sydney's most wealthy landowners, and he had sent some of his assigned convicts to look after this station. And many of the stations in these outlying areas were looked after by convicts who had been assigned as free labour to these landowners and were sent out into the bush to look after the livestock of the landowners. And on this particular station, Mile Creek Station, there was a station manager who was a free man by the name of William Hobbs. There was a stockman by the name of Charles Kilmaster. There was a hut keeper by the name of George Anderson, and there were two Aboriginal men from another part of New South Wales who were helping them. And it was a very, very basic station. There were wooden huts, 3 wooden huts next to a creek, and a clearing in the bush, and a few stockyards where they would herd the cattle. A few weeks prior to the massacre, a large group of about 60 Aboriginals had come to the property and sought refuge because they'd previously been living on another station and they realised they were at risk being attacked by groups of whites. So in desperation they came to Mile Creek Station and they were allowed to camp there. And they were perfectly peaceful. They had not been responsible for any attacks on cattle, let alone on white men. On the 10th of June 1838, a group of 11 stockmen, led by a man called John Henry Fleming, descended upon the Mile Creek Station on horseback. John Henry Fleming was a free man. His father had been a free man in the colony, and even his grandfather was one of the first babies to be born in New South Wales in 1879. They descended upon this station, and when the Aboriginals who were camped on the side of the creek saw these horsemen racing towards them, they ran to the huts where the whites were, hoping to seek protection from the whites. They actually went into one of the huts. The station manager was not present at that particular time. He'd gone to another station, so it left only 2 whites and their 2 Aboriginal servants. These 2 whites, Kilmaster and Anderson, were confronted by this large group of mounted and armed stockmen, obviously wanting to do harm to the Aboriginal population. Kilmaster was threatened by these 11 stockmen, and he joined them. He got his horse, he got his saddle, he got a gun, because in those days every white carried a gun in the bush, and he joined the 11 stockmen, thereby making up 12. The other white on the station, George Anderson, tried to confront these white stockmen and tried to convince them not to do any harm to the Aboriginals, but he failed. The Aboriginals were the adults were tied up inside the hut. Their children were around amongst them, and they were literally dragged out by this rope, each of them tied to the rope, and literally forced to walk about 600 metres to a little valley where it couldn't be seen from the huts, where they were slaughtered, every single one of them. Their bodies were then placed on a fire, and their bodies were burnt. A few days later, the station manager, William Hobbs, came back. He went to the scene of this fire and counted up 28 bodies. He was so horrified that he reported the matter to the local magistrate who, when I say local, he was about 300 kilometres away in what we today call Scone. The matter was also reported to the governor, Governor Gibbs, who was horrified at what had happened, and he had received strict instructions from the government in London to do all that he could to protect the indigenous population of the colony. So he instructed his magistrate in Scone, a man by the name of Captain Denny Day, to take a group of mounted policemen to round up the perpetrators, charge them, and to collect evidence in the form of signed statements. Most magistrates would have done a very token job at doing this and would have failed to find the perpetrators, failed to arrest them, failed to get any significant evidence. But Denny Day was a most diligent magistrate, and he did a superb job, and he rounded up 11 of the 12 perpetrators, collected a lot of evidence, including from Anderson. One of the men that he arrested was Kilmeister, and the only man who was responsible for the massacre who wasn't arrested was the ringleader, John Henry Fleming. Because he was the only free man amongst the perpetrators, he had a lot more freedom of movement than all of the others, and he was able to escape to a farm in Queensland which was owned by one of his brothers. So the 11 men who were arrested by Denny Day were brought to Sydney for trial. And it's here that I'd like to introduce the real hero and protagonist of my book, the man who was the prosecutor of these 11 men at their trial for the murder of these Aboriginals. That man's name was John Hubert Plunkett, and he was the Attorney General of New South Wales. Now, in those days, one of the functions of the Attorney General was to do what we Crown prosecutors do now. He would conduct all of the major significant prosecutions of trials in Sydney. If it was a minor matter, it would go to a magistrate's court. If it was a major matter, it would go to the Supreme Court of New South Wales and be prosecuted by the Attorney General. When these 11 men arrived in Sydney, almost the whole of the white population was horrified that white men had been charged for the murder of what was called the Black Menace. It was considered that it was essential for these white people in the outlying districts of New South Wales to seek to protect themselves, to protect the pastoral interests of their bosses, and to remove the danger that was posed by this black menace, these black people who could move through the bush, appear anywhere, and were very difficult to find. There was no conception amongst the general population in Sydney that these Aboriginal people had a right to life, let alone that they had a right to any of the land or the right to their traditional food and their water supply. John Hubert Plunkett was different. John Hubert Plunkett had come to Australia from Ireland. He was a staunch Catholic. He was a very devout Catholic. And as a Catholic in Ireland, his family had suffered persecution and discrimination for hundreds of years. In fact, his greatest ancestor was Archbishop Oliver Plunkett, who was later to become Saint Oliver Plunkett, and who was the last Irishman to be martyred by the English in the most gruesome way one can imagine in, I think it was 1681. By the time Plunkett became an adult, there were already moves afoot to emancipate Catholics in Ireland, and it was because of that that Plunkett was able to become a barrister in Ireland, and at a very young age, I think he was 25, he was appointed as Solicitor General in New South Wales. He arrived in 1832, and when he arrived, the then Attorney General, a man by the name of Kinchela, was absolutely stone deaf. So there was no way that he could conduct trials in court. So Plunkett not only had to do the work of Solicitor General, but he also had to do the court work of the Attorney General. And in 1836, with the retirement of Kinchela, John Hubert Plunkett was appointed Attorney General. When he heard about these massacres, he was absolutely adamant that this was a case which he could use to demonstrate the principle that the law was there for everyone, that everybody was equal before the law, that murder was murder no matter who the victim was. And he was although he was a very religious man, he was a staunch believer in the value of secular, non-denominational public institutions and doing away with all of those divisions that had been suffered by his native land, Ireland, for so many centuries. The divisions based on religion, divisions based on race, divisions based on ethnicity, divisions based on wealth. He was an absolute egalitarian. And for his time, he was a very unusual man. And he saw this trial for what it was. He saw the actions of the white perpetrators for what it was. And we can look back on it now and we can see that what was happening was an attempted genocide. Were it to happen today, it would be labelled internationally as a state-sponsored genocide of the Aboriginal people. But for his time, John Hubert Plunkett could see that there was a terrible injustice that was being done to the Aboriginal people, and he was determined to make this case a lesson for the colony of New South Wales. He faced implacable hostility from the population of New South Wales, from the most wealthy landowner to the most humble convict. The whole white population was united in its opposition to this trial. In those days, you couldn't have a trial of a murder trial where there was more than one victim. So the prosecutor had to choose which victim he was going to use for the trial. And of course, he decided to choose his strongest case. By the time the matter went to trial, there'd been an organisation set up by the wealthy landowners, and they called it the Black Association, to raise money to pay for the legal expenses of the 11 perpetrators who were charged with the crime. And they hired 3 of the best barristers in New South Wales to represent these 11 men. They ensured that none of the 11 men would break ranks and do any deal with the prosecutor or give evidence at the trial. They tried every trick in the book to thwart John Hubert Plunkett's efforts to see justice done. And in that trial, that first trial, they succeeded, because the jury came back after a very long trial. It went into the second day. They came back with a not guilty verdict after 15 minutes. Now, normally what would happen in that situation is that the prosecutor would throw up his hands and admit that it was a lost cause. He tried his best case, it failed, and that would be the end of the matter. So when the Chief Justice, who presided over the trial, asked Plunkett, is there any reason why these men should not be returned to their former place of residence? He paused, and he thought deeply for about 20 seconds. And then he announced to the judge, yes, there is a good reason why they shouldn't be returned. I'm going to put them on trial for another one of the murders. And all pandemonium broke loose inside the courtroom, that this prosecutor was breaking with the tradition that if He lost the first trial. That was the end of the matter. And he decided to put them on trial a second time for a murder of a different victim, in this case a child. The second trial was held several weeks later. Again, the landowners behind the scenes tried every trick in the book, and some of them were so bizarre. They tried to stack the jury, they tried to intimidate jurors, they tried to intimidate the Crown witnesses. There were a whole lot of things that I've described in the book that they did. John Plunkett tried to convince 4 of the perpetrators to give evidence for the prosecution. He told them that if they were prepared to give evidence, he would not proceed with their trials. This was like giving them a gift of their lives, because in the event of a conviction, the only penalty that the court could apply is death by hanging. So he was saying to them, you cooperate with me and you will live. But not one of the perpetrators was prepared to break rank. So John Plunkett went to trial against 7 of the perpetrators, and the other 4 remained in jail to await another trial. John Plunkett used a device in this second trial that was so bold, so daring, so imaginative, and so successful that he managed to convince a jury of 12 of those ordinary citizens to convict the 7 stockmen. I won't tell you what the device was because you'll have to read the book. But let me say this about it. If I did the same thing now in a trial today, the trial would come to an immediate stop. The judge would castigate me, discharge the jury so that we'd have to start again, and probably the judge would report me to the Bar Association for professional misconduct. But in its day, what John Hubert Plunkett did was perfectly acceptable and perfectly rational. But it was something that enabled him to win that second trial. And as a result, the 7 men were hanged. For years afterwards, Plunkett was unpopular with many sections of the community who accused him of having murdered these 7 stockmen. Legal murder, they called it, when they were only acting in self-defence and when so many other convicts had been responsible for shooting Aboriginals and nothing had happened to them. I'm inevitably asked the question, did the trial change the course of massacres around Australia? The answer is yes and no. It didn't stop the massacres. It drove them underground. So instead of openly going around in large groups on horseback and just shooting whoever they came across, they achieved the same ends by surreptitious means. They would poison the waterholes of Aboriginal people. They would leave flour laced with strychnine for them to eat and do things like that. So the massacres continued, but in a different form. Plunkett eventually became accepted as an elder statesman of New South Wales. He achieved an enormous amount in so many different areas. He was responsible for many of the civil rights, which we just accept and take for granted today. But if we look back, we're able to see that he was responsible for many of them. Have you ever asked yourself, why is it that Australia became a secular, non-denominational society when the motherland, England, was a denominational society where the head of state was also the head of the state religion, where there was a state religion? How was it that New South Wales had no religion of state. The reason why is largely to do with John Hubert Plunkett and two governors that he worked with, who managed by incredible feat of creating the colony of New South Wales as a secular state without a religion of state. And that's why in 1901, when the Commonwealth of Australia was established, the Constitution provided that Australia is a completely secular state without any religion of state. John Hubert Plunkett was responsible for setting up the first public school system in New South Wales and the teacher education system that backed it up. He was responsible for the first public hospital, St Vincent's Hospital in Darlinghurst. In each case, he was absolutely adamant that these public institutions had to be open to everyone, had to be available equally to everyone without any discrimination based on religion, based on race, based on anything. He tried desperately to change the law to allow Aboriginal people to give evidence in the courts. And in that regard, although he tried, I think it was 4 times, unfortunately he failed, and it wasn't until after his death that Aboriginal people were allowed to give evidence in Australian courts. There were many other things that he did that I've described in the book. But John Hubert Plunkett today is virtually unknown. If you mention the name Plunkett, most people say, has that got something to do with Plunkett Street Primary School in East Sydney? Well, yes, the school is named after him. In fact, the school is named after the street, which is named after him. But very few people know who the street's named after. So the street and the public school are much more famous than the person that they're named after. And there are a number of reasons for that. John Plunkett was not interested in perpetuating his own memory. He was not interested in accolades. He was not interested in being recognised by society. He was not interested in how society would view him in the future. He was not interested in wealth. He was not a particularly sociable man. He was quite shy. He had a rather irascible personality. Not many people liked him. He didn't have many friends, but he achieved an enormous amount for the colony of New South Wales. And one of the main reasons why I wrote the book is that I believe that he deserves to be as well known as Governor Macquarie or Blackstone, Wentworth and Lawson or Oxley or Mitchell or Layla or Burke or some of the greats of colonial history in New South Wales. So I think at that point that's probably all I'll say about murder at Myall Creek. Maria asked me if I'd say a little bit about my own family history. I must admit I was a little bit reluctant to do that because when I was here a year ago I spoke about my family history, and I suspect that there are some people here who have heard it already. Can I ask you to raise your hand if you were here last year and heard me speak about it? 1, 2. Okay, most of you haven't. Well, in that case, I'll go ahead. As Maria mentioned, my Italian family comes from Verona and Torino. My great-grandparents moved from Verona to Torino, where my great-grandfather set up a paint factory. The building is still there today. I was there not so long ago and actually had a look at it. My grandparents, Rosina and Guido Tedeschi, and my father, Roberto Tedeschi, left Italy in 1938 because of the racial laws against the Jewish community, of which they were members, which had prevented my father from continuing his education. They went to Switzerland for nearly a year and then emigrated to Australia. one of the biggest regrets that my father had in his whole life was that he missed the last year of high school at D'Azeglio School in Torino, and he felt that his education had been truncated, particularly because he failed to finish studying the Divine Comedy, which would only have been completed at the end of his last year. They came to Australia and they arrived in August 1939, and of course the following month war was declared, and within a short period of time Italy was on the Axis side. My father got labouring jobs, and when Italy declared war against the Allies, my grandfather, Guido, was interned at an internment camp in Hay. So you can imagine what it was like coming from downtown Torino to country Hay in the middle of summer. My grandmother immediately went and tried to explain to the authorities that they were Jewish refugees who had fled from the fascist regime in Italy and that they were therefore no risk to Australia. So the response of the police that she spoke to was, well, show us your passport with the word J in it, because that's what the Germans did. And she explained to them that there's no J in Italian. They thought that couldn't be right, she must be lying, so she's obviously a spy for Mussolini. Anyway, my grandmother tried for a year to rescue her husband, my grandfather, from the internment camp at Hay, without any success, until one day she was travelling in a tram and started speaking to the tram conductor about her plight and the plight of her husband. And she mentioned that her and her husband and her son were Jewish refugees from Italy, and that he'd been unfairly interned because they didn't understand. The authorities thought that all Italians were Catholic. And this tram conductor said to her, "That's atrocious. I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to go and see my friend, the Premier of New South Wales." Now, I'm sure that all of you, with your knowledge of Italy, would understand that if you said something like that in Italy, if you said, if a bus conductor said, "I'm going to go and see my friend, the head of the Provincia," they would say, "Yeah, sure. The hospital's just down the road." But at the time in New South Wales, the Premier of New South Wales was a man by the name of William McKell, a member of the Labor Party, who was later to become Governor-General. But he was a man who had risen through the ranks of the trade union movement. He'd been in the train drivers and bus conductors union, where this tram conductor had become friendly with him, risen through the ranks, become a lawyer, been very successful as a lawyer, and then went into politics, rose through the ranks of the Labor Party, and eventually became Premier of New South Wales. So this tram conductor went to the Premier and reported about this poor man who was stuck in Hay. And a few weeks later, there was a tribunal that was set up to hear my grandfather's case, and an order was made for his release. And I love telling this story because I think that it really exemplifies what Australia is all about. It says something very wonderful about Australia. My grandmother, Rosina Tedeschi, had a little coaching college in her home in Torino, where she would coach high school students in Italian and Latin predominantly after school. When she came to Australia, of course she couldn't do that. For reasons that I still don't understand, once my grandfather was released from internment camp, my grandparents set up a duck farm. Now, they had never engaged in any sort of agricultural activity before their lives. They were city slickers. They knew nothing about ducks or horticulture or agriculture or anything. And I think they had a very hard time of it. Somebody must have said to them, well, there's a lot of money to be made in ducks. And I heard wonderful stories about how my father would load the ducks in cages on the back of his bicycle and wheel them to the local railway station. But one day, towards the end of the Second World War, my grandmother... oh, perhaps I should go a step back. Once Italy joined the Allied side, there were ships coming to Australia from Italy full of migrants. And my grandmother and my father, because by that stage my grandfather had passed away, my grandmother and father would go to these ships in Sydney Harbour when they docked, because it was the only place in Sydney where you could get a cappuccino. And they would meet other Italian people who were living in Sydney who would also go to these ships for the same reason. And one of the people that my grandmother met was a man who was the head of the Italian department at Sydney University. And she explained to this man that she had this coaching college in Torino before she left Italy. Well, one day in about 1944, I think, maybe, I'm not sure it's 44 or 46, she received a message from her next door neighbour who had the phone on. Please ring this man at Sydney University. His name is Professor Shaw. So she rang him and he said to her, look, I've got a student who's failed his exam in Italian conversation. Would you coach him for his posts to see if he can get through the year without having to repeat? My grandmother agreed. She did such a wonderful job at coaching this student that he actually got a distinction in Italian conversation. So Professor Shaw then asked my grandmother, look, I've got a vacancy for a part-time casual lecturer in Italian conversation in my department. Would you like to do it just for this year? She said, yes, I would. 25 years later, my grandmother, Rosina Tedeschi, was still a part-time casual lecturer in Italian conversation at Sydney University. She was awarded an honorary MA degree when she finally retired in honour of having been in that capacity for such a long time. She was a much-loved member of the Italian department, and I still, to this day, many, many years after her passing, occasionally come across people who say that they were her students. Do we have one here? There you go. We've got one right here. You were too? There you go. Isn't that wonderful? Two people who were taught Italian conversation by my grandmother. I'm really chuffed. But again, I think it says a lot about Australia. That this woman who had really no qualifications to be a university lecturer could come to this country and could be so successful in a way that she could never have hoped to achieve back in Italy. So I think that's probably enough of my Italian story. I'm very proud of my Italian background. I've been to Italy many times. When I go there, I do get my Italian back, but I must admit I don't get much of an opportunity to speak it here. So I find it really hard to kind of suddenly switch. But I love Italy very much. I love going there. I love the language. I love the culture. I love the food. It's a fabulous country. And I'm very pleased to be here today to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'd like to ask you some questions. So if you don't mind, we just have a few question and answers. So is anyone up here who'd like to ask anything of Mark?
I hope you don't think I'm very rude, but Plunkett Street Public School is in Woolloomooloo, not East Sydney.
Oh,
I lived a few blocks from there, so I know it for sure.
you're quite right.
Just spoke about your grandmother. How old was she when she retired from working at the university?
I think she was in her early 70s when she retired.
Okay, and when she came to Australia, could Could she speak any English at all?
She learnt English on the ship coming to Australia. I think she knew a little bit in Italy, but not much. But I think she really honed her knowledge a lot on the ship, which of course took something like 6 weeks to come here.
Right.
Her English was reasonably good.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, your dissertation on the moral massacre is redolent of a number of books by John Watts, and I've read them all, and the genesis of these books was in a massacre similar to the one you've described. Are you familiar with his writings?
I'm not, no.
Well, I recommend them to you because it's treading the same ground as you have done with your book.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Had the honour of meeting your father about 60 years ago. I just came to Australia. I was here for about 2 weeks, and I needed a document to send in Italy, so I give procura of my brother. And I didn't know where to go. My English was very poor, like your mother. I learned a little bit on the boat coming in. But somebody indicated me Mr. Tedeschi. I said, okay. When he was in the city there near King's Cross, he had his office there. I went and I spoke to him, and I tell you what, I spoke with him for about 2 hours. And he helped me a lot. Telling me the way Australians have grown up and the right thing. But I'll tell you what, he did a great job for me because I had no problem after that one. I was very pleased to be here with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
They actually said to me something that I felt strange, which had to do with discrimination. They did feel there were instances of discrimination. And I had never felt that, even though I was born and lived in a very small town in Western Australia. I never felt it. So that will be a place where you'd expect it. So I guess the question to you is, in your profession, did you ever feel that at times, maybe not overtly, but you might have seen it, felt it, or something like that?
I don't believe that I've been discriminated against as an Australian with Italian heritage because of my name. I've never felt that. There is some discrimination in the legal profession, and there has been for a long time, but mainly I think it's discrimination against women. Perhaps to a slight degree against people of Asian background, people of Aboriginal background, but I've never felt discriminated against as an Australian of Italian heritage, no. There's a very large group of female prosecutors, and I was jokingly saying to my boss the other day, we're going to have an affirmative action program for men.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mark. That was really fascinating stuff. I'm going to be a little bit greedy. I've got 2 questions. You're clearly somebody with a passion for Indigenous law. So the first question I have is, clearly Indigenous law reform isn't sort of never-ending, ongoing process. To your mind, what is the next sort of significant step that we need to take in that area? And the second question is, what advice would you have for a first-year law student?
Okay. You're a first-year law student? Look, I think it's really important that Australians recognise that these massacres occurred and acknowledge them for the genocide that they were. I think that if we're going to come to terms with our history and become fully mature as a nation, it is really important that we recognise the terrible tragedies that were perpetrated on the Aboriginal community over many, many years that were state-sanctioned. And by state-sanctioned, sometimes it was actually instruments of the state that perpetrated them. The mounted police and the soldiers were sometimes the perpetrators of massacres. But at times it was also just standing by and allowing those things to happen. And that's why John Hubert Plunkett stands very tall in colonial history. My advice for you as a first-year law student, some people would say to you, go and study something else, but I wouldn't. I mean, I've been so fortunate in my career in the law, and what I've been most fortunate about is that I've found a niche area in the law that has particularly suited me. And so I think that the best advice that I can give a law student is, when you do qualify, to find an area of the law that you feel really passionate about, that you feel comfortable in. It may not be in the mainstream. You may not make a fortune, but if you're contributing to society and you are really passionate about what you do, then you are indeed very fortunate, as I have been. I must admit that one of the wonderful things when I go to Italy is that I don't have to spell my name. I remember the last time I came back from Italy, I went to a hotel to meet my sister, and I walked up to the reception desk and I said, I'm Mark Tedeschi, I'm here to see my sister, Claire Cotton. And the receptionist said, how do you spell that? And I said, C-O-T-T-O-N.
I'd like to thank you very much, Mark. I'm sure yes. The first one is Orange B88. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. One is Orange B73. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's B3. Okay, the next one's Orange B52. Right, refill. Orange again, 7. B25. Alright, lucky last one. Okay, purple, B27. Thank you. Thank you again, Robert. Please don't.